In the beginning, there was only silence. A silence so thick it seemed older than stone, heavier than centuries, the kind of silence that seeps through convent walls and presses against the heart until even the sound of one's own breath feels like an intrusion. It was in this silence that she lived, a nun whose name has been swallowed by time, preserved only in fragments, whispers, and manuscripts too fragile to survive the centuries intact. Yet her story remains, like a wound the church could never fully heal, a fire that smolders beneath the ash of history. She claimed that an angel came to her, not in peace, not in the soft glow of celestial comfort, but in a blaze of light so violent it seared her flesh. When the figure left, her body bore marks, burns that no earthly fire had made. The church, terrified by what it could not explain, locked her away. And thus, a mystery began that has never ended. Imagine the world in which she lived, the Middle Ages, when faith was not a private thought but the very air one breathed. To live without the church was to live without a compass, without structure, without identity. Heaven and hell were not metaphors, they were destinations more real than the ground beneath one's feet. Every sickness, every storm, every harvest, every death was read as a message from above or below. Angels were not distant guardians of poetry, but soldiers in an eternal war. Demons were not symbols, but predators hiding in every shadow. In such a world, when a nun cried out that she had been visited in her cell, the possibility of her truth could not be dismissed. But nor could it be embraced without suspicion, for if angels were real, so too were deceivers clothed in light. The first report comes to us not from her lips, but from those who found her trembling, her habits scorched in places, her skin marked with raw burns. The sisters of her convent were divided. Some fell to their knees in awe, convinced they stood in the presence of divine mystery. Others whispered in fear, refusing to meet her gaze, as if the fire that licked her body might leap onto their own. And always, there were those who thought of demons, of the adversary who comes not with horns and smoke, but in disguises so radiant they confuse even the faithful. The question was not whether she had been touched by something, but by what. From the beginning, the church demanded control of the story. Her burns were examined by clerics and physicians alike. They prodded her flesh with trembling fingers, muttering prayers as if the skin itself might answer. Was it the hand of God that had seared her? Or the devil, mocking heaven with counterfeit miracles? Each explanation only deepened the unease. For the marks were undeniable, and the pain in her eyes was real. Yet angels were never meant to leave scars. Saints were branded with wounds that imitated Christ, not with blisters that smelled of charred flesh. Something about her story disobeyed the categories they knew, and what does not fit becomes dangerous. And so they confined her. Not to punish, not at first, but to contain. A locked chamber became her world, its walls both prison and sanctuary. By candlelight she prayed, or tried to. But her prayers, she said, were interrupted by visitations, sometimes blinding, sometimes silent, sometimes so intense her body convulsed until she collapsed. Every mark of fire became a new entry in the chronicles of her captivity. The cell was no longer only hers, it belonged to the church, to history, to legend. And in that cell, reality itself seemed to blur, until no one could say with certainty whether she was chosen by heaven or tormented by hell. The suspense of her story rests not in what happened once, but in what continued. For this was not a single night of terror, not one visitation only. It became a pattern, a rhythm of light and fire that stretched across weeks, months, perhaps years. Each time, she was more exhausted, more scarred, more hollowed by the mystery she could not escape. And each time, the church grew less inclined to believe her, more convinced that what she saw was deception. Yet they did not release her. They feared her too much for that. A wandering visionary could ignite rebellion, could inspire the unlearned masses to question their priests. Better that she remain locked away, where her voice could be muffled by stone. Yet stone cannot silence a story. It only makes it echo louder. In the villages beyond her convent, word spread of the nun with burning skin. Some called her saint, others witch, others fool. But all agreed on one thing: her tale was not ordinary. And in an age where ordinary explanations rarely satisfied, the extraordinary became irresistible. Pilgrims sought to glimpse her, only to be turned away. Travelers carried the rumor farther, embroidering it with each retelling. An angel descended, they said. No, a demon in disguise. No, it was Christ himself, testing his bride. The versions multiplied, each one heavier with mystery, each one bending her life into myth. In that way, she ceased to be only herself. She became a vessel, into which the fears and hopes of a century were poured. To the faithful, she was proof that heaven touched earth in ways too terrible to comprehend. To skeptics, she was the danger of female hysteria, the madness of cloistered minds. To the Church, she was a problem that could not be solved, a threat that could not be eliminated without scandal. And to us, across centuries, she remains a riddle that unsettles even as it fascinates. For what could leave burns upon a body without flame? What force could enter a cell unseen, and alter the skin of a human being? Was it imagination, hallucination, illness? Or was it, impossibly, the touch of the divine? The more we peer into the darkness of her story, the more it reflects back our own questions. For what is faith, if not belief in the unseen? And what is terror, if not the suspicion that the unseen does not love us? The nun lived between those poles, her life stretched taut between devotion and dread. Every visitation was both gift and curse. Every scar was both evidence and accusation. And the Church, with its need for order, could not allow such contradictions to breathe freely. Better to bind them in silence, even if that silence became a crucible that would forge legend from pain. Her eyes, described in one surviving account, were said to burn brighter than her wounds. Not with joy, but with the fever of someone who had seen too much. She tried to speak of what she saw, but language betrayed her. Angels are not easily described. She spoke of wings that were not wings, of fire that did not consume, of voices that did not sound but thundered inside the skull. And always, the aftermath, the sting of flesh, the unbearable weight of being chosen, or cursed. Listeners wept, or trembled, or accused her of lying. But none forgot her words, and that is why we know her still. To begin with her story is to begin with unease. For there is no safe place here, no certainty to cling to. She is not offered as an example to follow, nor as a warning to shun, but as a mirror of the eternal human struggle, the desire to encounter the divine, and the fear of what such an encounter might demand. What if the divine does not comfort but destroys? What if holiness is not gentle but searing? What if the touch of heaven feels indistinguishable from the torment of hell? These questions haunted her nights, and they haunt us still. And so, in this first telling, we step into the shadows of her cell. The candle flickers. The stones sweat with damp. Her breath trembles in the stillness. Somewhere beyond the walls, the Church debates her fate. But here, in this moment, only she and the mystery remain. The air thickens, and the light changes. Perhaps it is the moon. Perhaps it is something else. She closes her eyes. And when she opens them, the room is no longer empty. The visitation begins again. And with it, the fire that will consume not her body alone, but the very certainty of those who try to understand her. They gathered around her as if she were an altar and a warning all at once. Sisters of her convent, men of the cloth summoned from beyond its walls, physicians whose hands trembled as they reached toward her skin. The sight of the wounds was impossible to deny. Angry red marks ran across her arms, her neck, her chest, marks that did not belong to the gentle touch of God. Flesh blistered as though kissed by fire, but there was no smoke, no candle overturned, no earthly cause to blame. She sat quietly, her breath shallow, her lips moving as if reciting prayers to a God who seemed too distant to answer. The chamber was filled not with reverence, but with unease. If heaven had visited her, why had it left the trace of hell? Whispers spread quickly through the convent corridors. Some sisters believed her body had been chosen as a canvas for divine mystery, as saints once bore the wounds of Christ. Yet others recoiled, insisting that angels do not burn, that holy visitations do not leave the scent of charred skin lingering in the air. Fear grew alongside fascination. For every nun who wanted to touch her scars as relics, Another begged for her isolation, convinced that the devil had brushed her body in mockery of the sacred. The church had seen such things before, and always the verdict was uncertain. Visions could be divine ecstasy, or dangerous delusion. Wounds could be holy signs, or marks of hysteria, madness, possession. Physicians examined her with eyes sharpened by years of tending to bodies broken by plague, childbirth, and famine. They could describe burns, but not these. The edges were too clean, the patterns too strange, as though shaped by something intentional. Some noted that the wounds healed only to reappear, often after she claimed another visitation. To them, it was either a trick she played upon herself or something no natural law could explain. They left with their diagnoses wrapped in uncertainty, unwilling to commit, unwilling to say that she was saint or sorceress, victim or fraud. And yet, none of them denied that the marks were real. The burns existed. The pain was undeniable. Only the source remained hidden in shadow. Clerics approached with questions rather than cures. They demanded to know what words the angel had spoken, what messages had been carried from heaven to her small, dimly lit cell. But her answers disturbed more than they comforted. She spoke of fire that felt like love and pain that felt like command. She spoke of wings that darkened the room, of voices that echoed like thunder inside her skull. To some, these descriptions resembled the raptures of mystics who felt God more deeply than flesh could endure. But to others, they sounded suspiciously like the temptations of demons, who could wear the mask of holiness to seduce and destroy. How could they tell the difference? How could anyone? In that world, the body was not merely flesh, it was proof, evidence, the battlefield where divine and infernal forces left their signatures. The scars of saints were preserved as relics. The sores of lepers were feared as punishment. The body was a text to be read, a scripture of blood and bone. And here, before them, was a scripture no one could read without trembling. If it was divine, it was terrifying. If it was demonic, it was cunning. And if it was neither, if it was only the symptom of a troubled mind, then it revealed something equally unsettling, that the mind itself could summon fire, carve wounds upon its own vessel, and blur the line between imagination and reality. No answer was safe. Every possibility carried its own danger. As weeks passed, her condition became not only a source of spiritual unease but a spectacle. The convent, once a place of quiet devotion, became crowded with eyes. Villagers came, whispering of miracles. Pilgrims arrived, pressing to see her scars, hoping to brush against holiness, or perhaps to confirm their worst fears. Authorities tried to contain it, to keep the matter sealed within sacred walls. But the more they tried to hide her, the more her story escaped. Rumors took root, multiplying with every retelling. In one version, the angel left a message that the church feared. In another, she was chosen to suffer in Christ's place. In yet another, she was already lost, consumed by the fires of hell, her body the proof of damnation disguised as piety. And always, she endured. Her burns healed and broke open again, her strength waned and returned, her prayers rose and fell like waves against stone. Through it all, her eyes remained steady. Those who looked into them swore they saw something they could not name. Some said it was madness, the gleam of a mind untethered. Others claimed it was devotion so pure it bordered on the inhuman. A few dared to whisper that it was the light of something not of this world, terrifying in its brilliance, impossible to hold, impossible to survive. Whatever it was, it silenced questions as quickly as it raised them. For in her gaze, the mystery deepened. The church began to keep records, documenting each wound, each testimony, each flicker of her condition. Such chronicles were never neutral. They were weapons of control, ways to shape how future generations would remember, or forget. They catalogued the burns with cold precision, measuring and describing, but they could not capture the terror of seeing them form. They recorded her words, but stripped them of the trembling, the tears, the fervor with which she spoke them. The official account was a cage for her truth, designed to keep it manageable, presentable, safe. Yet even within those careful lines, the wildness of her story leaked through, undeniable and unsettling. And so the wounds spoke louder than any testimony. They forced everyone who saw them to choose, to believe in a heaven that destroys as much as it saves, or to believe in a devil who laughs through fire, or to believe in the frailty of the mind, which can conjure torment out of longing. None of these answers brought peace. All of them left scars of their own. And through it all, the nun herself remained silent more often than she spoke, staring at the walls of her cell, listening for the wings she dreaded and longed for. Her body was her confession, her defense, her indictment. It said what words could not, that she had been touched by something that left marks beyond denial. The weight of fire pressed down on her, and on all who tried to judge her. For in those burns lay a truth no one could comfortably hold. And as her story spread, it began to slip out of the church's control. No prison of stone, no locked door, no guarded manuscript could stop the fire of rumor from spreading. And thus, the decision was made: she could not walk free. She would remain confined. But her confinement was not the end. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one in which silence itself would become her loudest testimony. And that is where the story turns, leading us into the next shadow. For if wounds could speak, silence could scream. What the church feared most was not her burns, but what they implied: that heaven itself could be cruel, or that hell could disguise itself as glory, or that the human body was not bound by natural law. And so, she would be locked away. The mystery would be contained within walls. But history shows that mysteries locked in darkness do not die. They grow. They wait. They become legend. The door closed with a sound that seemed louder than thunder. Iron scraped against stone, bolts slid into place, and with that, her world grew smaller than the width of her outstretched arms. Confinement was not new to nuns. Convent life was, in its essence, a life of enclosure. But this was not enclosure by choice. This was a prison carved inside what was once her sanctuary. No bell would summon her to prayer beside her sisters. No communal hymns would carry her voice into the vaulted air. Instead, her prayers would echo against walls that answered only with silence. The church had decided she was too dangerous to be free, too mysterious to be trusted. And so she would remain, a riddle locked in stone. The cell was damp, its walls sweating with the slow drip of centuries. A single window, small as a palm, allowed a sliver of light to crawl across the floor each day, shifting like a sundial of suffering. At night, shadows gathered thickly, broken only by the flicker of her candle, which bent and sputtered as though afraid of its own flame. It was in this dim world that she waited for the next visitation, the next wound, the next judgment she could not escape. Confinement did not end the story. It only tightened it, winding the thread of suspense until it could cut through even the thickest silence. Her body became both evidence and curse. Every scar she carried into that chamber was studied, catalogued, whispered about by those beyond her reach. And yet, inside, she was left with only the pain and the memories of light that burned like fire. She pressed her palms together, whispered the prayers of her order, begged for clarity, but clarity did not come. Instead, she felt again the heat that rose without flame, the sudden dizziness, the collapse of strength. Each time she awoke, she knew another wound would mark her flesh. Alone in her prison, she bore them without witnesses. Yet when the clerics returned, when the church scribes recorded their findings, it was as though the walls themselves had testified against her. But silence is never empty. In her confinement, the nun began to hear what others could not. The dripping of water became the ticking of eternity. The flutter of wings beyond the convent walls became a reminder of the angel, or the deceiver, that had once entered her chamber. At times she thought she heard voices murmuring prayers just beyond her door, only to realize it was the sound of her own mind unraveling in the echo. Confinement became not only a physical condition but a spiritual crucible. She was alone, yet never alone. Watched, yet unseen. Guarded, yet abandoned. The paradox pressed in upon her as relentlessly as the cold stone pressed against her back. To understand her fate, one must remember that the church feared contagion, not of illness, but of belief. A story like hers could spread faster than any plague, igniting the minds of peasants who longed for miracles, or rebels who longed for proof that the church did not hold all the keys to heaven. If her wounds were divine, they undermined authority. If they were demonic, they revealed that evil could breach even consecrated walls. If they were imagined, they showed the terrifying power of the human soul to deceive itself. In every case, her presence was dangerous. And so, she was confined not simply to protect others from her, but to protect the church from the questions she embodied. Still, questions seeped through the cracks. The guards who brought her food could not help but stare at her hands, wondering if fire would leap from her touch. The sisters who whispered outside her door carried tales to their families, who carried them further still. Rumors thrive in darkness, and her silence became louder than any confession. In the villages beyond, people spoke of the imprisoned nun with awe. Some claimed she glowed in the night, that her cell lit up with heavenly fire. Others swore she was chained because the devil himself came to her in secret, and the church dared not admit its weakness. Each tale added another layer of myth, and each myth ensured that the church's attempt at silence was a failure. For her, confinement became a dialogue with eternity. She spoke less to her keepers and more to the walls, to the air, to the presence she could not banish. Nights stretched into endless corridors of thought. She remembered her childhood, the reasons she had chosen the habit, the devotion that once seemed simple, unshakable. Now every prayer was weighted with fear. Was she serving God or tempting him? Was she chosen or deceived? Her cell became the battleground not only between heaven and hell, but between faith and despair. And slowly, despair began to win. Her words, when she did speak, grew stranger. She spoke of wings that filled the cell, of heat that wrapped her like a shroud, of whispers that promised both salvation and destruction. It is in these moments that we see the deeper terror of confinement. The body may be locked in stone, but the mind is free to wander into abysses from which it cannot return. Alone, the nun was left with only herself, and within herself, the mystery multiplied. She scratched prayers into the walls until her nails bled. She pressed her burned skin against the cold stone as if to quench the fire. She sang hymns softly into the night, her voice breaking, trembling, echoing back as though mocking her devotion. To her captors, she was a problem contained. But in truth, she was becoming something far more dangerous, a legend being born in silence. History shows us that institutions often believe silence will preserve order. But silence rarely does. Silence is fertile soil where rumor grows wild. By locking her away, the church believed it had extinguished the flame. Instead, it had hidden it from view, where it could grow hotter, more mysterious, more untouchable. Her prison was not the end of her influence, but its transformation. She ceased to be only a woman. She became an enigma, a symbol, a question that could never be safely answered. And symbols do not stay locked away. And so, segment 3 closes with the sound of silence, the heavy, echoing silence of a nun imprisoned, her story spreading beyond walls, beyond time. She is alone, but never forgotten. Isolated, but endlessly present. The confinement meant to erase her has instead written her more deeply into the story of her age. And as centuries will later show, what is locked away in darkness often emerges not weaker, but stronger, stranger, more enduring. The walls of her confinement had learned to hold silence, but they could not hold back the presence that returned again and again. She told those who questioned her that the angel did not vanish when the church locked her away. Instead, it grew nearer, darker, more insistent. At first, she had spoken of blinding light, of radiance too fierce for mortal eyes. But now her descriptions shifted. The light became fire, not gentle flame but consuming heat. The wings, once radiant, now flickered like shadows stretched by a torch. The face, once luminous, was now veiled, its features indistinct, its gaze unbearable. She whispered of it, as though the very act of speaking summoned it closer. And those who listened left her cell with their hearts heavier, uncertain whether they had glimpsed heaven or heard the testimony of the damned. The church scribes recorded her words with trembling hands. They wanted clarity, categories, order. Yet her testimony slipped through their fingers like smoke. His wings were fire, she said, and they touched my skin until it cracked. His voice was thunder, but it spoke words I could not resist. At times she described ecstasy so overwhelming it dissolved her into tears. At other times, she spoke of dread so deep she thought her soul would shatter. The contradiction was unbearable, a messenger who inspired worship and horror, a visitation that sanctified and destroyed. The angel became a figure of shadow, a being whose very ambiguity was more terrifying than open malice. For at least the devil declared himself. This being, cloaked in fire and radiance, declared nothing, yet demanded everything. In the long hours of her isolation, she began to doubt even her own senses. Was it truly an angel? Or had her mind, starved of human company and stretched by years of fear, woven visions from darkness? The burns were real. She felt them sting, saw the blisters rise. But the presence, was it external, or had it become an echo within her soul? She whispered her doubts into the stone, only to hear the answer in the rush of sudden heat across her skin. Each time, the marks reappeared. Each time, the angel left proof behind. Proof and silence. Proof and terror. Proof that no explanation could contain. This was the danger that gnawed at the church. Angels were meant to uplift, to protect, to deliver divine messages that reinforced faith and order. Yet her angel left chaos in its wake. Chaos in her body, chaos in the convent, chaos in the hearts of all who heard her words. If it was truly a being of heaven, then heaven itself seemed divided, cruel, unfathomable. If it was demonic, then the devil's deception was more cunning than anyone had dared imagine. And if it was neither, if it was born only of her suffering mind, then the human soul was a furnace that could conjure horrors rivaling any inferno. None of these options brought comfort. All were dangerous. And so the church resolved to tighten the chains of silence, even as the whispers grew louder. But whispers cannot be contained. Sisters of the convent carried them in secret, speaking of the angel that scorched as much as it sanctified. Pilgrims, denied access to her cell, invented their own versions. In taverns, travelers told stories of a nun who danced with fire each night, who bore the embrace of a creature with wings like molten iron. Some called it proof of divine wrath, a warning that God's angels were not the tender beings of paintings but warriors who burned sin from flesh. Others claimed she had been seduced by the enemy, that her angel was nothing more than a demon cloaked in light, laughing as it marked her body. The story twisted with every tongue, but the core remained: an angel, or something like it, had left fire in its wake. And so, the whisper became more dangerous than the wounds themselves. For wounds heal, scars fade, but words linger, multiply, ignite. The nun herself seemed both victim and prophet, warning and example. Her silence was filled with stories she never told, stories invented by those who feared or adored her. And each story added weight to her presence, making her confinement less a punishment and more a shrine. Visitors who could not see her still prayed outside her walls, pressing their foreheads to the stones, begging for a glimpse of the mystery within. Her cell became a paradox, a place meant to contain danger that became instead a source of power, a fountain of dread and devotion alike. What terrifies us most, perhaps, is not open evil but the uncertainty of appearances. If the angel was truly divine, then heaven is not the comfort we imagine. If it was demonic, then hell is closer than we dare to admit. And if it was only her mind, then our minds themselves are unreliable, able to conjure torment as real as any flame. The whispers of her angel forced every listener to confront their own fears. For each chose the explanation that haunted them most. Believers saw proof of holiness. Doubters saw proof of deception. And the church saw proof that mystery itself could destabilize power. Night after night, she lay in her chamber, waiting. Sometimes it came. Sometimes it did not. The not knowing was worse than the pain. She would stare into the darkness, her candle long extinguished, feeling the air grow heavy, feeling the heat stir before it touched her. And when it did, she did not scream. She prayed. She whispered the only words she could: "If you are from God, spare me. If you are not, reveal yourself." But no answer came. Only fire. Only scars. Only silence afterward, deeper than the silence before. And so, the nun's whispers became the world's whispers. Her angel, whether real or imagined, became a shadow stretching across centuries. In every telling, it shifts shape, as angels and demons always do. But one truth remains, unsettling and eternal: she was not untouched. Something, or someone, marked her body, scarred her spirit, and left behind a question that no wall, no church, no age of reason could erase. The whisper of the angel still lingers, not in her voice alone, but in ours. They brought her before them as though she were both witness and accused, both relic and threat. The chamber was cold, a hall where stone pillars rose like sentinels, where torchlight bent against shadows that seemed to listen. At its center sat the tribunal, a circle of clerics, robed in black and crimson, their eyes sharpened not only by faith but by fear. Before them stood the nun, frail from confinement, her skin still bearing the traces of fire. They had gathered not merely to question her, but to control her story, to claim dominion over the mystery she embodied. In the medieval world, a miracle could elevate the church's power, or fracture it beyond repair. And so, they needed to decide: was she holy, was she heretical, or was she something worse? Her body was evidence enough to silence the casual doubter. Blisters did not invent themselves. Scars did not bloom without cause. Yet the tribunal was not concerned with the visible, but with the invisible. They demanded words, coherent, orthodox, submissive words. "Tell us," one asked, voice echoing through the chamber. "What message did this angel bring?" She closed her eyes, trembling, as though the very memory could reignite her skin. Her answer came slowly. "He brought neither peace nor comfort. He brought command." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Command. Not consolation. Command. Not healing. The tribunal leaned closer, as though her words might bite. "And what was the command?" they pressed. She hesitated, then whispered, "To endure. To endure." It was both too little and too much. Too little, because it offered no revelation, no divine prophecy, no fresh gospel that could sanctify her suffering. Too much, because it suggested a God who inflicted torment not as punishment, but as duty. The tribunal could not bear such ambiguity. For ambiguity was poison to power. And so they pressed harder, their questions like arrows. Was the angel clothed in radiance? Yes. Did he speak of Christ? No. Did he name himself? No. Did you resist? I could not. Each answer made the silence heavier, more unbearable. For what kind of messenger spoke without scripture, shone without love, and left wounds instead of wisdom? Was it an angel? Or was it the adversary, clever enough to appear as light, cruel enough to leave fire? The records of the tribunal, what fragments survive, are as chilling as her testimony itself. They describe her voice faltering, her hands shaking, the way she looked not at the judges but at something beyond them, as if her angel stood there still, silent but watching. They describe how the clerics argued among themselves, some seeing her as victim, others as deceiver, still others as vessel of demonic possession. In their deliberations, the human fear of mystery becomes plain. They did not seek truth. They sought certainty. And certainty was something her story could not give. The tribunal called witnesses. Sisters of her convent testified to what they had seen. The burns, the trances, the strange heat that filled her cell when no fire was lit. Some swore it was divine. Others insisted it was a snare of hell. Physicians spoke again, offering explanations that collapsed under the weight of the wounds themselves. No disease matched them. No self-inflicted injury seemed sufficient. The tribunal recorded these contradictions carefully, but rather than resolving them, they grew more entangled. Every voice added another thread to the tapestry, until the image was so tangled no one could discern its shape. And in that tangle, the church saw danger. For a story without resolution is a story that spreads faster than one with an ending. At last, they turned to Scripture, searching for parallels. They recalled Moses and the burning bush, which blazed without consuming. They recalled the angel that struck down the armies of Assyria. They recalled the fiery sword that barred the gates of Eden. Fire, they reasoned, was not always punishment. Sometimes it was proof of God's nearness. Yet they also remembered Satan, the deceiver who clothes himself as an angel of light. They remembered the fires of Gehenna, the eternal torment promised to the wicked. Fire, in Scripture, was both judgment and blessing, curse and sanctification. And so the tribunal circled endlessly, like moths around the flame of her mystery, unable to draw close without being consumed. The nun herself sat silently through much of it, her eyes fixed on the ground. But when they demanded her defense, she lifted her head, and for a moment, even the clerics recoiled. Her gaze was steady, her voice quiet but unwavering. "I did not ask for him," she said. "I did not seek him. He came to me, unbidden, and he left me with fire. If it was God, then I submit. If it was not, then I am already lost. Judge as you will. I cannot change what has been done to me." The tribunal faltered. For hers was not the speech of a heretic, nor the fevered rambling of a madwoman. It was the voice of one who had surrendered everything, even the hope of being believed. And that surrender was more terrifying than any rebellion. In that moment, the tribunal revealed its true purpose. It was not to discern the divine. It was to preserve the authority of men. For if her story were accepted as holy, it would imply that God bypassed the church to speak directly to a cloistered woman. If her story were condemned as demonic, it would imply that the devil could invade even the most sacred of spaces, making a mockery of consecration. If her story were dismissed as madness, it would imply that the human mind, left in silence and prayer, could generate visions so vivid they scarred the flesh. Each option weakened the edifice of certainty the tribunal sought to uphold. And so, they did not conclude. They delayed. They stalled. They locked her away again, hoping time itself would provide the judgment they could not. Yet history tells us time did not silence her. Her story slipped through cracks, carried by whispers, expanded by rumor. And so, the tribunal's indecision became its failure. The nun who stood before them did not need to win her case. She only needed to exist. And in her existence, scarred and trembling, she posed a question that no judge could answer, no church could silence. What happens when the messenger of heaven leaves behind the marks of hell? The body was never meant to carry so much mystery. Flesh was supposed to rot, to bleed, to heal, to fail, predictable in its mortality. Yet in her case, the body defied all categories. The wounds she bore were not wounds one could map, not injuries one could explain with accident or illness. They came without warning, blossoming across her arms, her chest, her back. They healed, only to break open again, as though some invisible hand redrew them each time her skin began to mend. To the church, this made her more dangerous than ever. For in the medieval mind, flesh was scripture. Scars were letters, blisters were words, pain was a message. Her body spoke, and what it said no one wanted to hear. The clerics who visited her wrote of the smell of burning that clung to her, even when no flame had touched her habit. Physicians who examined her flesh recoiled at the patterns of the marks. Not random, not chaotic, but deliberate, as though traced with purpose. Some said they resembled the wings she claimed to have seen. Others insisted they were the claw marks of demons. Whatever the shape, they were undeniable. And so, the records multiplied, each trying to impose order on something that resisted it. She became a case study in the collision between faith and doubt, between medicine and mystery, between the limits of human knowledge and the vastness of the unknown. Her suffering became spectacle. There were those who came not to pray, not to investigate, but to see. They wanted to look upon the proof of what she claimed, to witness the burnt flesh of faith itself. Whispers say that when the burns were fresh, they glowed faintly in the candlelight, as though embers smoldered beneath her skin. Some claimed to see shapes within the wounds, a cross, a wing, a flame. Others claimed to hear sounds when they leaned close, soft crackles like fire-consuming wood. These details, impossible to verify, grew like vines around the story, turning her pain into myth. And yet, at the core of the myth was always the same truth. She suffered, and no one could say why. The theology of pain had long been a pillar of Christian devotion. Saints bore stigmata, bleeding from hands and feet as Christ had. martyrs burned at the stake, their flames described as purifying, even beautiful. Suffering was sanctified, a bridge between human weakness and divine will. But her pain did not fit the pattern. Stigmata mirrored Christ, her burns mirrored nothing. Martyrs died publicly in flames, she lived privately, consumed by fire that left no wood, no smoke, no ash. Her pain had no precedent. It was as though heaven had written a new, incomprehensible gospel upon her flesh, one the church itself could not read aloud without risking scandal. And so they tried to cover it in silence. But silence only made it burn brighter in the imagination of the people. Philosophers of later centuries would argue that the body can betray the mind, that hysteria and fervor can manifest in physical symptoms. And perhaps that was true. Perhaps her devotion, her fear, her isolation had twisted into a fire that consumed her from within. But in her own time, such explanations did not exist. There was no language for psychosomatic torment. There was only the language of the divine and the demonic. Every wound was a battlefield. Every scar was proof of a war invisible yet undeniable. And in her body, that war raged more visibly than in any text, any sermon, any vision. Her body became the sermon, her pain the homily no priest dared to preach. Yet amid the fear, there was awe. Some who witnessed her burns fell to their knees, convinced they stood in the presence of a miracle too terrible to celebrate. They kissed the hems of her habit, begged her for intercession, as though her suffering had carved a path closer to God than theirs could ever reach. To them, the burnt flesh was not horror but holiness, the price of intimacy with the divine. Others shuddered and turned away, whispering that no God of mercy would scar his servant so. To them, her wounds were proof not of holiness but of deception, of a trickster cloaked in glory. And between these poles she hung, suspended in ambiguity, unable to control how she was read, unable to escape the fate of being transformed into a story larger than herself. The nun endured as she always had, silently, prayerfully, her body carrying the weight of mystery. But even she began to doubt. She wrote, or dictated, words that hinted at exhaustion deeper than her burns. She wondered if she had been chosen as vessel or victim, if her endurance was sanctification or punishment. At times she begged God to end it, to take her life as he had taken her body. At other times she clung to the belief that her pain was necessary, that it was shaping her into something beyond flesh. Her faith wavered, but never fully broke. Perhaps that was the most miraculous thing of all. Not the burns themselves, but her willingness to endure them, her refusal to curse the hand that struck her, even as it scorched her again and again. The church, for its part, remained trapped in its own bind. To sanctify her was to risk legitimizing chaos. To condemn her was to risk silencing what might be divine. And so they did what institutions often do when faced with unbearable ambiguity. They contained, they documented, they postponed. They left her to burn in silence, hoping the mystery would fade when she did. But mysteries do not fade. They linger, smoldering in the ashes of memory, waiting for breath to reignite them. Her story, carried in fragments through the centuries, proves that the attempt to bury the inexplicable only ensures it will never die. And so, segment 6 lingers in the image of her flesh, blistered, scarred, glowing faintly in the candlelight. Flesh that bore witness to something no tribunal could name, no physician could cure, no church could silence. Flesh that became the battlefield of faith itself. And as we close this part of her story, we are left with a question as searing as her wounds. When the body speaks in fire, who among us dares to interpret its language? The years gathered around her like a cloak of shadows, heavy, unshakable, inevitable. When the tribunal's indecision gave way to confinement, many believed her story would wither in silence, that without an audience, her visions would fade, her burns would heal, her voice would vanish. But time has its own laws, and silence is not absence. Silence is presence magnified. Silence is a storm waiting to break. And so, as she lingered behind the locked door of her stone chamber, her story did not die. It deepened, darkened, spread like smoke through corridors and across villages, filling minds more effectively than any sermon could. Her cell was small, barely larger than a grave. The walls leaked with damp, their stones whispering the cold of centuries. A single slit of a window admitted light, but only enough to mark the passage of days like wounds cut across the floor. In this space, the hours had no edges. Morning and night dissolved into one another. Candles sputtered, prayers faltered, but still she endured. Her body was marked again and again, the burns rising like unwanted blossoms. Yet her lips spoke less and less. Where once she had described the angel in words, wings, fire, voice, she now fell into silence. The silence was not emptiness. It was weight. It was a sermon delivered without sound. The sisters who brought her food each day felt it first. At the threshold of her door, they hesitated, as though crossing into her presence carried danger. Some whispered that the air around her cell was warmer, as if the fire of her angel seeped through stone. Others insisted they heard faint murmurs, prayers or cries, though when they pressed their ears to the door, all was still. They left quickly, yet they carried her silence with them. And they carried it into conversation with others, who carried it further still. Soon, beyond the convent walls, silence became rumor, and rumor became legend. The paradox was sharp. She had been locked away so that her influence might be contained. But containment bred hunger. People wanted to know what the church feared. Pilgrims came, pressing their foreheads to the walls of the convent, hoping to draw strength from the unseen prisoner within. Peasants whispered of her as a saint in secret. Others spread tales that she was no longer human at all, that wings of fire had sprouted from her back, and that her silence was the silence of one already half in heaven. Meanwhile, skeptics insisted she was a witch, her silence nothing but the plotting of demons. In every telling, she was more than herself. She had become a symbol, a vessel for the anxieties and desires of her time. Inside, the silence was less myth and more torment. The absence of voices, the absence of freedom, gnawed at her mind. She scratched prayers into the stone with her nails until they bled. She whispered fragments of scripture into the air until her voice cracked and died. She pressed her scarred flesh to the wall, trying to draw strength from its coldness, but even stone gave no answer. In the long nights, when even the faint glow of candles was denied to her, she lay awake, waiting. Sometimes she dreamed of the angel, its wings unfurling across the dark. Sometimes she dreamed of fire that consumed her cell until only ash remained. Sometimes she dreamed of nothing at all, a void deeper than any silence she had ever known. Her silence became a mirror in which others saw themselves. To the devout, it was the silence of a saint consumed by God. To the fearful, it was the silence of possession, of a soul devoured by hell. To the skeptical, it was the silence of madness, the unraveling of a mind too long caged. And to herself, it was all of these, and none. For she could not know what her silence meant. She could only live within it, breathe it, carry it like a second skin. At times it crushed her, pressing her into despair so deep she begged for death. At other times, it felt like an intimacy beyond words, as though God had chosen her not to speak, but to embody mystery itself. Years passed, and her silence grew into an aura that clung to the convent. New novices whispered of her before they even saw her door. Monks in distant abbeys wrote sermons warning against the dangers of false visions, yet their very warnings kept her story alive. Her silence became contagious, infecting those who spoke of her. Priests hesitated when asked to explain. Chroniclers left their sentences unfinished. Even those who denied her sanctity could not deny the power of her presence. For what is more unsettling than a story that cannot be resolved, a riddle that refuses solution? She aged, her body wasting slowly, but her silence remained as strong as ever. Sometimes the burns appeared still, faint but undeniable, reminders that her mystery had not ceased. At other times, months passed without incident, and the church began to hope she would fade quietly into obscurity. Yet each time they thought her story would die, whispers revived it. A merchant claimed he saw flames through her window. A pilgrim swore her shadow moved when no candle burned. A sister confessed she heard her praying in languages she did not know. Truth or invention, it made no difference. The silence had become fertile soil where legends rooted and grew wild. And in that silence, she endured. Endurance was her vocation now, her only sacrament. She no longer tried to resist the fire, no longer tried to explain. She surrendered to what came, whether from heaven or hell. Her body carried the testimony, her silence carried the rest. And together, they built a legacy stronger than any words could have managed. The church had thought silence would weaken her story. But history proves otherwise. Silence amplifies. Silence transforms. Silence is the echo that lasts longest after the voices are gone. And so, her confinement did not erase her. It immortalized her. In the hush of her chamber, in the quiet that smothered her breath, she became eternal, not through speech, but through silence that burned brighter than fire itself. The centuries did what the tribunal could not. The nun's body wasted, her voice faded, her silence consumed her. The stone cell that had been her crucible became her tomb. In time, the door opened not for judgment but for burial, and her bones were carried quietly into consecrated ground. To her contemporaries, she was gone. But history does not always bury what is inconvenient. Sometimes, it preserves it, not as truth, not as falsehood, but as fragments, shadows, manuscripts half burned and half remembered. And that is how she survived. Not in flesh, but in parchment. Not in presence, but in echoes. The first records were clinical, the tribunal's documents, observations of burns, testimonies of sisters, cautious notes from physicians. They were written in the tight, anxious Latin of men who feared contradiction. These records did not claim certainty. They only catalogued unease. Yet even these were copied, preserved in abbey libraries where curious monks read them by candlelight, adding their own marginal notes, half prayer, half warning. With each retelling, the words shifted. Her silence grew more profound. Her wounds grew more luminous. Her story, once a cage of contradictions, became a canvas for imagination. And so the manuscripts multiplied. Sermons from distant towns mention her briefly, as a warning against visions too bold. Collections of miracles sometimes include her as a footnote, a nun scarred by fire who may have been holy, or may have been deceived. Folklore absorbed her more eagerly. In one village she was remembered as a saint who burned for others' sins. In another, as a witch locked away because priests could not control her power. In yet another, she became a nameless figure who warned children not to lie, lest angels mark their skin with fire. Truth dissolved, and shadow replaced it. The manuscripts themselves became haunted objects. In monasteries where her story was written, monks swore the ink would sometimes blur, as if smoke had risen from the parchment. In cathedrals where her tale was preached, listeners claimed to smell burning when the preacher spoke her name. The written word, meant to contain her, became another vessel of contagion. For the more the church tried to frame her as anomaly, the more the story escaped those frames. Once written, it could not be unwritten. Once copied, it could not be erased. And so she survived in the margins, between the lines, as shadow more potent than substance. Centuries later, when scholars of mysticism leafed through fragile codices, they found her there, unnamed sometimes, or misnamed, but always recognizable. A nun confined for visions of fire. A body scarred without cause. A silence too loud to ignore. Some dismissed her as invention, a parable mistaken for fact. Others pursued her trail, seeking the original cell, the original bones. Yet even their skepticism ensured her endurance. For every dismissal required her to be spoken of again, and each speaking breathed her back into life. But manuscripts are not merely vessels of memory. They are also mirrors. The nun's story bent with each age that copied it. In times of plague, she was invoked as one who bore God's wrath upon her flesh, sparing others. In times of heresy, she was cited as warning, proof of the devil's cunning. In times of reform, she was remembered as victim of a church too fearful to embrace mystery. Her silence became whatever the age required it to be. And so, she became not only a woman but a cipher, filled, emptied, filled again by the pens of generations. The most haunting accounts are those written in fragments, where only a few lines remain. A scrap of parchment in a convent archive, she bore the fire without screaming. A marginal note beside a psalm. Beware the angel that wounds. A sermon copied by hand, where in faded ink one sentence trembles. Her silence was louder than our hymns. These fragments remind us that history does not always preserve clarity. Often, it preserves shadows, enough to haunt but never enough to satisfy. And perhaps that is why her story persists. For certainty dies. Shadows endure. And so segment 8 becomes a meditation on manuscripts, the fragile, flammable threads that carried her story across centuries. The nun who was locked in silence became louder after death, her presence multiplied by ink and rumor. Her silence became scripture for some, scandal for others, legend for all. She lived not in body but in shadow, not in voice but in the echo of voices that could not stop speaking her name. The manuscripts that carried her memory eventually fell into the hands of thinkers who no longer trembled at every rumor of demons, who no longer read every scar as proof of God. They sought reasons not in heaven or hell, but in the labyrinth of the human mind. Yet as they traced her story, even they found themselves unsettled. For the mind, they discovered, is its own cosmos, capable of summoning visions that wound, terrors that scar, ecstasies that burn hotter than fire. And in her tale, they saw not only the shadows of theology, but the furnace of psychology, centuries before the word even existed. What force within a person can conjure flames without smoke? What power of imagination can blister the skin and break the flesh? Some called it hysteria, the frailty of women overcome by solitude and devotion. Others called it ecstasy, a state in which the soul grows so near to God that the body suffers as collateral. Later still, it was called psychosomatic illness, where belief itself shapes tissue, where thought itself leaves wounds. None of these explanations erases the terror. For whether divine, demonic, or self-created, the pain was real. The burns were real. And reality, regardless of source, leaves scars. Her silence, then, was not only spiritual but psychological. Isolation bends the mind, twists perception, makes whispers into shouts, shadows into presences. Locked away in her cell, her thoughts circled endlessly, consuming themselves, until they produced fire as surely as stars produce heat. In the darkness, her angel may have been born not from heaven, not from hell, but from her own soul. Yet if that is true, what does it mean for us? That within the fragile boundaries of the human mind lies the power to create both paradise and inferno, to summon angels that save and angels that destroy? The fire in her flesh mirrored the fire in her thoughts. And the more one considers it, the less surprising it seems. Have we not all felt the heat of shame on our skin? The burn of grief in our chest? The fever of love, the ache of loss, the sting of fear? The body is not separate from the mind. The mind is not separate from the body. In her case, the boundary collapsed entirely. Her faith, her terror, her endurance all fused into a single phenomenon. Fire that consumed without consuming, scars that testified to invisible battles. She was not saint or witch, not fraud or prophet, but human stretched to the very limits of what flesh and spirit can endure. Philosophers meditated on her as symbol. They saw in her the danger of ungoverned imagination, which can make demons out of shadows. They saw in her the proof of faith's cost, that to believe deeply enough is to risk burning alive within one's own body. They saw in her the mirror of humanity itself, torn between longing for the divine and terror of its nearness. For is that not our condition? We seek transcendence, yet fear it. We pray for God to appear, yet tremble when he does not remain safely distant. Her angel, whether real or imagined, embodied that paradox. The divine that wounds, the vision that destroys. Theologians of her age had no language for this paradox, yet they sensed it. Later thinkers, physicians, psychologists, poets, recognized it more clearly. They saw in her scars the evidence of what belief can do when stretched beyond endurance. Faith is not always comfort. Faith can be fire. It can scorch as much as it sanctifies. And the mind, in its desperation, can summon that fire whether heaven wills it or not. Her story is terrifying not because it proves heaven or hell, but because it proves us, our capacity to transform longing into torment, to make symbols into wounds, to carry eternity in our fragile skin. Even now, centuries later, her silence unsettles because it reminds us that the border between imagination and reality is porous, fragile, dangerous. How many of our own pains are born not from the world outside, but from the fire we kindle within? Anxiety that keeps the heart racing, grief that leaves the body aching, guilt that gnaws like a physical wound. The mind shapes the flesh as surely as the flesh shapes the mind. She was only its most extreme example, her cell a crucible in which that truth became undeniable. And so segment 9 turns inward. The tribunal, the manuscripts, the rumors, these are history. But her story lingers because it speaks to something deeper, something universal. The fire in the human mind. Whether her angel was celestial, infernal, or self-born, the result was the same. Scars that still disturb us, silence that still unsettles us, questions that still burn in the marrow of our thought. And in that way, she is not only a nun of the Middle Ages. She is each of us, when we confront the mysteries our minds cannot master, the visions our words cannot contain, the fires our souls cannot quench. The story circles back to its beginning, a nun, a cell, a body scarred by fire. Centuries have passed since the last lock clicked shut on her door, but her silence still lingers. She is gone, her flesh decayed, her bones dust, but the echo of her ordeal has outlived her. It survives not in relics or canonization, but in fragments, whispers, manuscripts that refused to vanish. She remains not as saint or witch, not as martyr or fraud, but as a question. And questions never die. Her confinement was supposed to erase her. Instead, it preserved her. The tribunal's verdict faded, the convent walls crumbled, the names of her judges forgotten. Yet she endures because she cannot be resolved. An angel that wounds, a silence that shouts, a body that refuses explanation. The paradox is the reason she still matters. For her story confronts us with truths we would rather avoid. That the divine, if it comes, may not comfort. That evil, if it comes, may disguise itself as light. And that the mind itself can blaze with fire strong enough to scar the flesh. The Church sought to make her a warning, but warnings fuel curiosity. Physicians sought to name her wounds, but naming did not heal them. Chroniclers sought to fix her in their texts, but every copy changed her. And so she survived in shadow, always more than the words that tried to bind her. To some she was a saint too holy to canonize, to others a woman deceived by hell, to others still a mind undone by silence. But across centuries, her presence unsettled everyone. Her silence is the heart of her legacy. In the medieval imagination, silence was never neutral. It could mean holiness, madness, possession, or guilt. In her case it became all at once. Silence was her defense when words would not be believed. Silence was her prison when the Church denied her voice. Silence was her sermon, louder than hymns, echoing through rumor and legend. Even now, we lean into her silence, trying to draw meaning from what cannot be spoken. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps her story endures because it resists resolution. Faith without mystery is brittle. Reason without shadow is blind. She forces us to stand in the space between, to admit that some encounters leave scars deeper than explanation. Her burns were not neat stigmata echoing Christ. They were raw, chaotic, without precedent. Her angel did not bless or console. It commanded, it burned, it left her trembling. She bore in her flesh the truth that transcendence is never safe, that mystery is as much wound as wonder. Imagine her final night. The candle sputters. The walls are damp with centuries of silence. Perhaps she hears wings in the dark, or perhaps she hears only her own breath, ragged and slow. She closes her eyes. She knows she is abandoned, yet chosen. Alone, yet not alone. And when her breath stops, her silence does not. It expands, filling the chamber, filling the convent, filling centuries with questions that cannot be put to rest. Her story reminds us that what we seek in the divine is not always what we find. We want peace, but we may find terror. We want consolation, but we may find fire. We want clarity, but we may be given paradox. Her silence testifies to the cost of mystery, the price of faith that ventures too near to the burning core of the unknown. To some, she is warning, to others, beacon. But to all, she is unforgettable. The centuries that carried her forward did not soften her story. They sharpened it. Each retelling stripped away comfort, leaving only the raw outline of paradox. An angel that may not have been angel. Wounds that may not have been wounds. A silence that may not have been empty. The endurance of her tale suggests that humanity cannot live without such mirrors. We need them, however unsettling. They remind us that faith is not certainty, that reason is not mastery, that life is not safety. They remind us that to be human is to stand in the tension between awe and fear, between longing and dread. Her silence, we said, was fire. And fire, though it consumes, also illuminates. In her silence we see ourselves, not as saints or monsters, but as beings forever haunted by questions too large for words. Her scars are not ours, but we know what it is to be marked by the unseen. Her cell is not ours, but we know what it is to feel trapped by silence, by longing, by uncertainty. She remains a symbol because she was human to the extreme, human at the edge where flesh, spirit, and mystery converge. In the centuries after her death, her memory surfaced in unexpected places. A footnote in a sermon warning against false visions. A marginal note in a psalter, beware the angel that wounds. A folktale told to children in a distant village, that if they lied, an angel would burn their skin. The fragments never align, but they never vanish. And this persistence itself is testimony. Stories that comfort are soon forgotten. Stories that unsettle, that refuse to yield resolution, are the ones that endure. She endures because she leaves us unsteady. The nun in her cell is not an answer, but a reminder that the world is not safe, that the categories we cling to cannot hold everything, that sometimes what appears holy burns, and what appears demonic commands devotion. She is a reminder that silence can speak, that wounds can preach, that questions can outlive the bodies that carried them. So the nun who claimed an angel visited her, who bore the burn marks of that encounter, who was locked away until silence became her only companion. She is not gone. She remains in the question. She remains in the fire. She remains in the silence that speaks long after the voice is stilled. And as long as we tell her story, we are invited to step into her silence, to feel its weight, to confront its fire, and to accept that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured.